Is the second part of a two-part video series that I'm posting. This specific series is covering how to work with MS SQL and Talend and integrate the two together. So we're going to cover how to create a job and add a MS SQL operator inside of Talend. And we're also going to cover how to create the login on Microsoft SQL and make sure you have the proper permissions so that they can be integrated together. I'm going to share my screen here, and we're starting at slide 65 in the PowerPoint. If you haven't covered the previous slides up to now, that would be a good idea to get comfortable with the different inputs inside of Talend. So we're going to create a job here, and we're going to call it dim employee data loading. And all I have to do here is right click my job designs, create job, and say dim employee data loading. Okay. The purpose we can leave pretty generic to learn TOS, and this will input a SQL table employee to Talend and output to target source. Okay. We can finish that, and now it's going to create this job. We can see all of our components on the right and all of our settings for the components on the bottom. We're going to need three components. So if I go to slide 66, there are the TDB input, the TMAP, and the TLOG row. You can read a little bit more about those on the PowerPoint. I'm going to drag them in here. TDB input is the last one we need. And there it is. So right now they're not connected to each other, but we're going to have to configure them before we can connect the input to the output. Now, the TDB input expects a database, and we can manually create these settings, or we can add it to the metadata like we did with our delimited files and our XML or Excel files earlier in the class. So I'm going to show you how to go about doing that. Before we set up the database connection, we want to make sure we actually have the database we're trying to pull the data from. So slide 67 is a link to the AdventureWorks DB BAK file, which is a database backup file. This is also provided in Blackboard. You can download that and extract it from the RAR file, and then make sure you restore the database. The steps to do that are on slide 68, and I can show you how to do that quickly now. So on localhost in SQL Server Management Studio, you can see I already have this database here, AdventureWorks DW 2014. I'm going to right click and delete it from my server, and then I'm going to show you how to restore the database. We right click the database folder, hit restore database, and then I'm going to select device, browse, and then add, and I'm going to locate where I downloaded that BAK file. It's very important for Talend that you save all of your files in the input folder on the C drive, because that's going to be the same file directory structure I use while grading your work. So you need to create an input folder on the C drive and an output folder. We're going to select AdventureWorks DW 2014.bak, click OK once more, and then click OK a final time, and it's going to tell me it was restored successfully. Here we can see the database has been restored and all the tables are present. Coming back to the PowerPoint, we're going to go to slide 70. I'm going to skip over slide 69 because I don't believe we need that as a step right now, but we'll come back to it just in case we do. Slide 70 is talking about SQL Server Configuration Manager. All you have to do to open that is start typing in SQL Server Manager, and the version for our version of SQL 2019 is Manager 15. If this doesn't show up when you search for it, okay, for some reason, because it's not a standalone application and it's installed with SQL Server, it might not be present. You're going to have to browse to this file directory path on your machine for 2019, c/windows/syswow64, and then double click SQL Server Manager 15.msc. You can also right click that file and pin to start, and then it will show up when you start typing it in. Okay, and if I go open file location, this is just the shortcut. If I right click and open the file location again, we can see here it is inside of that syswow64 folder. And all I did to add it to my start was right click and I pinned it to the start. You can also pin it to your taskbar if you want. So we're going to open up SQL Server Manager, and inside of SQL Server Manager, there's a few things we need to do to actually make sure that SQL Server can communicate with Talend. Okay, the first thing we need to do is click this little arrow on the SQL Server network configuration, and you're going to see the protocols for MS SQL Server. Right now, there's three: shared memory, named pipes, and TCP/IP. By default, TCP/IP is disabled. You're going to need to enable it by right-clicking and clicking Enable. You can also go to Properties, and then in the Enabled dropdown, select Yes. Okay. The other property I want you to double check is IP addresses, and make sure that your TCP port is 1433 for all of the different IP ports. Okay, so scrolling down, we want to make sure that IP all is 1433 and click OK. So make sure this is enabled. Then the next thing you need to check is your SQL Server services. We're going to see our SQL Server here, and it's running. We're going to come back here later and stop this service and restart it once we make some changes in SQL Server. So once you've changed the IP, TCP and IP port settings, this is the instructions on slide 71, and double checked that the TCP port is 1433, you're ready to move to the next step. Check that SQL Server is running, and then we can proceed to slide 72. Slide 72. So this is where we can start enabling SQL Server with Windows authentication. So Windows authentication means that now we don't have to log in through only our Windows account. We can also create a SQL Server login and password that Talend can use to communicate with the SQL Server. So I'm going to jump over to Management Studio. I'm going to right-click the server itself, and I'm going to go to Properties. Inside of Properties, I'm going to go to Security, and I'm going to make sure that this option is checked. By default, only Windows Authentication mode is the default option. We're going to add SQL Server and Windows Authentication mode. This way we can still log in through our Windows login, or we can create a SQL Server account. Once you've clicked that, you can check OK. Going back to the PowerPoint, slide 73, this is where we're going to create a new login user for SQL Server login. The password will be SA123 at, SA at 123 at 123. And I'll show you exactly how to type it right here. It's going to be SA at 123 at 123. Okay, and I'm just going to copy this. And make sure your password is the exact same as mine so that when I run your work on my machine for the assignment, it will be able to log in. How do we add this login? Well, you can see here from the screenshot, but I'll show you. We're going to come over to Security, Logins, and I already have an SA user. You might already have an SA user. I also have an SA2, so I'm going to create a new one called SA3. If you don't have either of those, you can create a user called SA. I right-click the Logins folder and click New Login. Inside of Login Name, I'm going to type SA3, but you can just type SA. We're going to make it SQL Server Authentication, and then we have to provide the password SA at 123 at 123. And again, repeat SA at 123 at 123. All right, the rest of these, we can just leave the default options. You can change things like the default database when they log in or the language. I'm going to click OK. And now we can see that user is here. We also have to make sure we go to the properties of that user and status and make sure it's enabled. Sometimes you'll see when you create a new login, and I'll just refresh this folder, there's a little red X beside the icon. That means that that login's not enabled. So right-click, Properties, Status on the tab here, and then Enabled. Click OK, and then when we refresh the logins folder, that red X disappears. Jumping back to the PowerPoint here, we can see that there's the step for enabling the SA user. Now, we can add this DB connection in Talend, but before we do, let's actually test it in SQL Server Management Studio. So right now, I'm logged into localhost through my admin bvanaragon Windows account. I'm going to click this button to disconnect from the server, and then I'm going to click this button to reconnect. We can see I was using Windows authentication before. Now I'm going to use SQL Server authentication. Now I can type in my login name, SA3, and then I can type in the password SA at 123 at 123. I can try to connect. It says my password's expired, SA at 123 at 123. Let's try this, at 123 at 123. And it's going to fail because we need to refresh or restart our database or our SQL server. We can also see here it says the password change failed. Now, I'm just going to show you, I would have to restart my entire machine to restart this. You'll have to right click your SQL Server in SQL Server Configuration Manager, click Stop, and then Start. Or you can just click this button, Restart, and then it will stop that service from running in the background. It will restart it with the new security settings. So anytime we make changes to security settings or server roles, we have to restart our SQL Server Management Studio and our SQL Server actual process running in the background. So once this finishes, I should be able to log in with that account, and then I might even have to restart my SSMS, but we'll try it first without restarting. And if that doesn't work, then you have to restart your computer. The SQL Server browser also sometimes has to be restarted. Mine is stopped right now, so we're just going to try this. Connect. I don't know why it's saying the password's expired. I'll just try with my SA account and go SA at 123 at 123. And we can see now I've logged in, and I've logged in with the SA user. Okay, and I can disconnect and reconnect. We can try, make sure you're on SQL Server Authentication. SA, we can try with my new one, but 123 at 123. It's asking for a new password. Enter another password. Let's try. And there we go. I just made a new password, probably because it had the same password as one of my other accounts. But we can see once I restarted SQL Server, I'm logged in with this SA3. So now what we have to do is we have to create what's called a DB connection for this connection, for this connector inside of Talend. And all those steps are there in the PowerPoint. We can right click DB connections, create connection, and these are the settings we have to use. So we'll right click, create connection, and we can call this my database connection. We can call this SQL server to connect to SQL server, right? And in here, we're going to select the Microsoft SQL Server option. I'm going to select open source JTDS, and then we can see here our connection string is blank. As I type my login, SA3, and then my password, and then the server, localhost, we can see that the connection string is updating. Now here's that port that we needed to double check earlier, remember in our TCP and IP settings, 1433. The database we're using is AdventureWorks DW 2014, and I'm just going to double check that name, AdventureWorks DW 2014. And then you can try testing your connection. It might work. We'll just try it, connection failure. Sometimes you have to add this parameter, SQL Express. And then a lot of times once you add that parameter, instance equals SQL Express, it will work. Now I'm going to try with my other login that I configured earlier, SA at 123 at 123, and we're going to test the connection. And we want to see this connection successful. Okay, once that connection is successful, we can click finish, and this will basically save that connection string as a parameter or as a variable inside of Talend. Okay, so we can just see it's taking its time to finish loading that into the metadata. And very similarly to how we created a schema in our file delimited, now I have a database connection, and we can see that we can have schemas for the tables there and queries as well. So now all we have to do is follow the steps in the PowerPoint. Once we've created the connection, we can right click on the SQL Server and retrieve a schema. And we're going to try to bring in the DIM employee schema, or the dim customer schema from the database. So I'm going to right click on my SQL Server and retrieve schemas, and then it should pull from SQL Server Management Studio. Okay. If I expand that database, oh, it says it's not accessible, and that's probably because it's getting accessed through Talend right now. It's going to pull all of the schemas from that database. So what we're going to do is click Next, and it's going to retrieve all the schemas based on the wildcard character. So select table name from tables where table name is like. And as it's retrieving here, we're going to be able to expand the database. Hopefully I can click this. It's taking its time. There we go. And I don't want to select all of them. Okay, I just want to get DBO. Okay, that's the schema for the database objects. And as that takes its time, we're going to bring in dim customer and dim employee. Okay, so those two, creation status, there we go. It says success. We got 29 columns and 31 columns. I'm going to click next. And here we can see the schema being brought in. The name I will leave default dim customer, dim employee. It automatically, I'll maximize this screen so we can see, finds the primary key automatically. It checks this key value. It's an int identity column. Data type is int. We can see it's non-nullable because it's a primary key. The date columns, we can see bring in the date pattern, the length of the column, and the precision if it's a decimal. All right, and we can double check the employee table as well, but usually Talend's pretty good at bringing in these schemas from SQL. I'm going to click Finish. And now inside of my table schemas, we can see we've got two schemas that we're bringing in. So once we've retrieved those schemas, we can move on to slide 76, which is where we select the database that we created and the schema that we want to bring in. Okay, so we're going to click on TDBInput, select the database that we want to use, which is SQL Server, hit apply. And then you can see that you're going to get this warning that we need to install at least one external jar. And this is referencing that JDBC from slide 69 in the PowerPoint. You could go through this route, but all we have to really do is change the JDBC provider to open source JTDS, and that warning goes away. Then we can follow the PowerPoint instructions here and fill out the host, port, and schema to bring in the table that we want. So the host is localhost. The port is 1433, and the schema is DBO. The database is AdventureWorks DW 2014. And the username is the one we created earlier, SA. The password here looks like it's filled out, but as I mentioned in class earlier today, you have to type it in, and you have to type it inside of these double quotes, SA at 123 at 123. If you get rid of those double quotes, it won't work because Java convention requires text to be surrounded by double quotes. Click OK, and it won't show that it's been changed for security reasons. Coming down, the next step is to select the table name, which is dim employee, inside of the double quotes again, dim employee. And then the query type, we can do built-in, select, and I'm just going to go select all from DBO dot dim employee, like this, and end double quotes. All right, and so now one last step after typing that query is we should be able to bring in the schema that we brought input under this DB connection. So I'm going to click repository, yes. And then in my schema, I'm going to browse to DB connections, my database connection, table schemas, dim employee. And that's the schema we're going to use for this. I'm going to click yes. We can view the schema and make sure that it looks okay. This is the schema for that table. And then select all from dim employee. That query stays the same, right? Next, what we can do is we can, well, add the password. We already did that. And then slide 78, we're going to connect that source to the tmap. Okay, so I already did that here, but you're going to right click row. If I just delete this connection, right click row main into your tmap, and then we should be able to double click the tmap and see the schema input on the left. Again, very similarly, we just have to add an output table. We can Control A and drag all of these columns and see a one-to-one mapping. As I scroll, we can see the columns are mapped from employee key to employee key, etc. And all the lengths and date patterns are copied over. So I can click OK. And then we're almost done. Slide 79, we go from the mapping to the T-log row and select the schema again, verify that the output schema matches the input schema, and then select table as our output. So I'm going to right click my tmap row out1. That's the table we created. I'm going to click tlog row, and in tlog row, we're going to just sync the columns, view the schema, and it looks like it's been copied over correctly. I'm going to select table, and then I can go over to run, and it should connect to the database. It's starting a virtual machine to connect to the database in the background. And then it's going to pull that information in from the dim employee table, 296 rows. It's going to map them from the input to the output columns. And then we've got it printed out here in our Talend output T-log row. There it is, employee key, parent, employee key. This is the output screen. Congratulations, you've got MS SQL connected to Talend in the background. If you have any issues with the security settings or Microsoft SQL Server not restarting, you can restart your machine. You can restart SQL Server Management Studio, restart Talend. Sometimes it can be a little bit buggy. And once you've made all of those changes, double check everything in the video. I'm more than happy to help, but those are all the steps to take to make sure that it works and connects. And once you've got that working, you're set to start the assignment for Talend. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this useful, and I will see you in class.